Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Ozark Mountains. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing what places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1866, and America was just beginning to heal from the deep wounds of the Civil War. The Ozark Mountains, with their dense forests and hidden valleys, had always been a place of refuge for those seeking to escape, some from the law, others from society itself, and a few, perhaps, from their own memories. In Washington County, Arkansas, near the White River's western bend, there stood a cabin that locals would eventually come to know simply as the Boyle Place. In April 1869, a land surveyor named Jeremiah Hawkins was mapping the region for potential railroad expansion when he stumbled upon the isolated cabin nestled deep within a rocky hollow. The structure appeared to have been abandoned for some time, with tall weeds surrounding it and a distinct absence of smoke from the chimney despite the spring chill. According to Hawkins' field journal, he approached the cabin with professional curiosity rather than any sense of foreboding, a sentiment he would later regret documenting. The door stood ajar, creaking slightly with the mountain breeze. Hawkins called out, receiving no response. As a matter of routine, he entered to mark the structure on his maps. What he discovered inside the Boyle cabin would haunt him for the remainder of his life, and would eventually become the subject of whispered conversations throughout Washington County for decades to follow. The interior of the cabin was unnaturally preserved, as though the occupants had simply vanished in the midst of daily activities. A wooden table was set for three, with plates containing the desiccated remains of what appeared to be a meal. A pot hung over cold ashes in the fireplace. A rocking chair by the window continued to sway slightly in the draft. But it was what Hawkins found in the back room that caused him to abandon his survey equipment and ride immediately to Fayetteville to alert the county sheriff. The official report filed by Sheriff Thomas Muldrow on April 17, 1869, describes entering the cabin alongside Hawkins and two deputies. The document, preserved in the Washington County Historical Archives until its controversial removal in 1951, details the discovery in clinical terms that nonetheless convey a profound disturbance. In the back room, they found what appeared to be a workshop of sorts, shelves lined with dozens of glass jars, each containing various preserved specimens that Muldrow described only as items of a deeply concerning nature. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface stained dark. Dozens of handwritten journals were stacked neatly on a small desk in the corner. The sheriff immediately ordered his deputies to collect the journals and seal the cabin. Within days, a disturbing story began to emerge from the pages of those leather-bound books, the story of Tobias Boyle and what drove him to the remote hollow in the aftermath of the war. According to county records, Tobias Boyle had purchased the land in October 1866, paying in gold coins and providing little information about himself or his intentions. He arrived with what neighbors in the nearest settlement, some 5 miles distant, described as a woman with a haunted expression, and a male companion whose relationship to Boyle was never clarified. The journals, which began in November 1866 and continued until February 1869, documented Boyle's activities in meticulous, disturbing detail. Initially, they contained mundane observations about building the cabin, hunting game, and establishing a small garden. But by January 1867, the entries had taken a darker turn. Boyle, who identified himself in the writings as a former surgeon in the Confederate Army, began documenting what he called the continuation of my research, unburdened by the short-sighted restrictions of military oversight. What exactly this research entailed was never explicitly stated in Sheriff Muldrow's official report. Pages from the journals were deemed too disturbing for public record and were sealed by judicial order. However, testimonies from those who handled the documents suggest that Boyle had been conducting some form of experimental study, possibly related to his experiences during the war. The woman, identified in the journals only as E, was described as becoming increasingly withdrawn and fearful as the months progressed. The most disturbing aspect of the case emerged not from what was found, but from what wasn't. Though the cabin clearly housed 3 individuals, only 2 sets of personal belongings were discovered. The identity and fate of the 3rd occupant became the central mystery that would never be fully resolved. The last dated entry in Boyle's journal, February 22, 1869, simply stated, "The patience of observation must yield to the necessity of direct participation. E refuses to acknowledge the potential. Tomorrow, all will be clarified." After that, the journals fell silent. No bodies were ever found on the property, despite an extensive search of the surrounding area. The 3 inhabitants of the Boyle cabin had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only their possessions and the disturbing evidence of whatever activities had occupied their isolation. Following the discovery, local authorities made attempts to identify the previous occupants more completely. Records indicate that a Tobias Boyle had indeed served as a field surgeon with the 3rd Arkansas Infantry, but the trail grew cold after the surrender at Appomattox. No record existed of his movements between the war's end and his appearance in the Ozarks. The woman, presumed to be E, could not be identified at all, nor could the 3rd occupant. The sheriff's investigation initially focused on the possibility of foul play, with the assumption that Boyle might have harmed his companions before fleeing. However, the lack of any evidence of violence within the cabin contradicted this theory. The plate set for dinner suggested a sudden departure or interruption rather than a planned abandonment. One of the deputies, James Calloway, noted in his personal diary that approaching the cabin produced an unaccountable sensation of heaviness, as though the air itself resisted our presence. This sentiment was echoed by several members of the search party, with one man refusing to enter the cabin at all, claiming that the threshold seemed to push back against my intentions. These subjective experiences were dismissed by Sheriff Muldrow as superstitious nonsense, yet similar reports would emerge from virtually everyone who visited the site in subsequent years. More puzzling still was the state of the surrounding forest. Despite the cabin being situated in dense woods, searchers reported an unusual absence of animal tracks or signs within a 100-yard radius of the structure. The case might have faded into local legend had it not been for Dr. William Hawthorne, a physician from St. Louis who had taken an interest in medical practices during the Civil War. In 1887, while researching for a book on battlefield medicine, Hawthorne came across references to the Boyle case in correspondence with Arkansas officials. Intrigued, he traveled to Fayetteville to examine what remained of the evidence. By this time, the cabin had been demolished by locals who claimed it brought ill fortune to the area. The jars and most of the physical evidence had been destroyed on the orders of a county judge. However, the journals, or what remained of them after selective redaction, were still held in county records. Hawthorne was granted limited access, and his notes provide one of the few secondary sources on their contents. According to Hawthorne's private correspondence, later published in the Journal of Historical Medicine in 1912, Boyle's writings suggested a man obsessed with understanding the nature of human resilience. Having witnessed men survive grievous wounds that should have proven fatal, while others succumbed to seemingly minor injuries, Hawthorne quotes from the journals, I have become convinced that the conventional understanding of human vitality is fundamentally flawed. Hawthorne noted that Boyle's early entries displayed a clinical detachment, but as time progressed, a disturbing fervor entered his documentation. Particularly troubling were Boyle's observations on what he termed the partitioning of awareness during traumatic states. According to Hawthorne's notes, Boyle had developed theories about consciousness existing in divisible components, with the possibility of isolating and preserving these components under certain conditions. Boyle described witnessing soldiers on the battlefield who, despite catastrophic injuries, maintained periods of lucidity that defied medical explanation. These incidents had apparently convinced him that consciousness was not a unified phenomenon, but something that could potentially be sectioned like anatomical specimens. Hawthorne's research also revealed a disturbing pattern in Boyle's military career. Army medical records indicated that several of Boyle's patients had displayed unusual post-operative conditions, described by attending nurses as responsive yet absent. One report noted a soldier with a severe head wound who, after treatment by Boyle, remained physically animated and capable of following basic commands, yet seemed to have lost all sense of self. The report was filed as a curiosity rather than a concern, given the chaotic conditions of battlefield hospitals. The identity of Boyle's companions remained obscure, but Hawthorne's research uncovered a potential lead. Hospital records from Richmond in 1864 mentioned a Dr. Boyle working alongside a nurse identified only as Ellen M. Several patients noted their unusually close relationship, and one recovering officer wrote in a letter home about Dr. Boyle and his nurse companion performing examinations of an unorthodox nature after the senior surgeons had retired for the evening. Hawthorne was particularly interested in a notation in Boyle's military file, indicating that he had been briefly reassigned to an unnamed Special Medical Research Unit in the war's final months. The unit was reportedly tasked with developing advanced surgical techniques, though specific documentation had been lost in the burning of Richmond. This reassignment coincided with Ellen M.'s disappearance from hospital records, suggesting she may have accompanied him to this new assignment. The third resident of the cabin remained a complete mystery. Local rumors suggested various possibilities. An escaped prisoner, a patient upon whom Boyle wished to continue treatment, or perhaps a family member of either Boyle or the woman. Whatever the truth, this individual's identity would become central to the disturbing discoveries that followed decades later. Upon returning to St. Louis, Hawthorne compiled his findings into a monograph titled Unorthodox Medical Practices in the Late War, which included a chapter on the Boyle case. However, before publication, he received a letter from the Washington County Clerk warning that dissemination of information about the Boyle case might result in legal action for disturbing public sensibilities with unfounded speculations. Hawthorne removed the chapter, and his notes on Boyle were sealed among his personal papers until after his death in 1916. In the intervening years, the Boyle property changed hands several times, though it remained undeveloped. Local farmers reported that crops planted near the former cabin site withered inexplicably, and livestock refused to graze in the area. The hollow gained a reputation for being unwholesome, and by the turn of the century, it had been effectively abandoned to the encroaching forest. The Boyle case might have remained nothing more than a regional curiosity had it not been for the events of June 1923, when severe flooding in the White River Valley prompted geological changes throughout the region. A limestone sinkhole opened on what had once been the Boyle property, revealing a previously unknown cave system beneath the former cabin site. Local farmer Josiah Miller, who owned the land at that time, reported the discovery to authorities when his dog returned from investigating the opening with what appeared to be a human bone. County officials excavated the entrance to the cave and made a grim discovery. The narrow passages opened into a larger chamber that showed signs of previous human activity. Stone shelves had been carved into the walls, and rusted metal implements were scattered about a central stone table. Most disturbing were the markings on the walls, elaborate diagrams and notations etched into the limestone, reminiscent of anatomical illustrations, but with disturbing variations that defied conventional understanding. The cave contained no complete human remains, but scattered bone fragments were recovered. Most puzzling to investigators was evidence that the cave had been deliberately sealed from within, with large stones stacked in what appeared to be a barricade some distance from the entrance. This barricade had apparently been in place well before the recent sinkhole formation, suggesting that someone had intentionally closed themselves inside the cave system at some point. Officials quickly sealed the new entrance, citing safety concerns from the flooding. A brief mention appeared in the Fayetteville Democrat on June 14, 1923, noting only that unusual formations had been discovered on the old Boyle property and that the area had been closed to public access. However, before the cave was resealed, County Coroner Dr. Franklin Pierce conducted a cursory examination of the bone fragments recovered from the site. His report, filed with county records but never published, noted several anomalies. Pierce described precision cuts that could only have been made with surgical instruments, as well as evidence of drilling and the insertion of foreign material into the bone structure. Most disturbing was his observation that some fragments appeared to have been fused with a metal alloy of unknown composition, integrated in a manner that suggests it occurred while the tissue was still living. Pierce's report concluded with a recommendation that the bone fragments be sent to a university laboratory for more detailed analysis. The fragments, while human in origin, displayed unusual modifications. However, county records indicate that the specimens were instead ordered destroyed by Judge William Harrison, who cited concerns about potential desecration of human remains. Harrison, notably, was the nephew of a Confederate veteran who had served in the same regiment as Tobias Boyle. The matter might have ended there, but in 1945, Dr. Margaret Holcomb, a historian researching Civil War medical practices, uncovered the sealed records of the original investigation while working in the Washington County Archives. Her subsequent paper, published in the obscure Journal of Historical Appalachian Studies, connected several disturbing dots in the Boyle narrative. According to Holcomb, Boyle's military records indicated he had been reprimanded twice for conducting unauthorized procedures on wounded soldiers. More significantly, she discovered a report from a Confederate medical inspector suggesting that Boyle had developed what he termed unorthodox theories regarding human awareness during extreme physical states. The inspector recommended Boyle's dismissal, but the desperate need for surgeons during the war's final months apparently prevented any action from being taken. Holcomb also located what may have been the most revealing document in the case, a letter written by Ellen Morrison, a nurse who had worked alongside Boyle in Richmond, to her sister in Baltimore. Dated March 1865, the letter expressed growing concern about Boyle's behavior. His interests have shifted from healing to something I cannot comprehend. He speaks of thresholds between states of being and methods to extend consciousness beyond what nature intended. I fear his mind has been affected by the horrors we have witnessed, yet I cannot abandon him after all we have endured together. The letter went on to reference a patient known only as Subject 11, whom Boyle had apparently taken a special interest in following a severe head wound. T spends hours observing him, documenting every minute response. Last night I found him speaking to the patient about consciousness residing in compartments and how a properly prepared mind might be divided like segments of an orange, each maintaining independent awareness. When I entered, he grew silent, but his eyes held an excitement I have not seen since before Antietam. Holcomb theorized that Ellen Morrison was likely the E referenced in Boyle's journals, and that the pair had fled west after the war, possibly to continue Boyle's increasingly disturbing research away from scrutiny. More significantly, she proposed that Subject 11 might have been the mysterious third occupant of the cabin, a patient Boyle had somehow managed to remove from military custody to serve as a research subject. Holcomb's investigation led her to the records of the Chimborazo Hospital in Richmond, where Boyle had been stationed in early 1865. Among the patient logs, she found an entry for a soldier identified only as Patient 11, admitted with a severe head wound that had left him physically responsive but mentally vacant. The entry noted that the patient was transferred to Special Research Ward on February 12, 1865, with no further documentation of his condition or eventual disposition. This coincided with Boyle's reassignment to the Special Medical Unit, supporting Holcomb's theory that Boyle might have appropriated this patient for his own purposes. The most chilling aspect of Holcomb's research came from her discovery of a partial transcript of an interview conducted with Jeremiah Hawkins in 1889, shortly before his death. The elderly surveyor who had first discovered the cabin had refused to discuss the case publicly for decades. However, in this private interview conducted by a local historian, Hawkins finally elaborated on what he had seen in the cabin's back room. The jars contained things that had no right to be preserved, Hawkins stated, parts that appeared human but distorted in ways I cannot describe. And on the table, there was a contraption of brass and wood with straps as though to secure a person. But it was the drawings that disturbed me most to this day. Detailed illustrations showing a human form with dotted lines dividing the body not by conventional anatomical standards, but in ways that suggested Boyle believed consciousness itself could be sectioned and preserved. Hawkins went on to describe pages from Boyle's journal that had never been included in the official record. He wrote of consciousness as something that could be divided, like slicing a fruit, with each segment retaining aspects of the whole. There were passages describing experiments, I cannot call them anything else, in which he claimed to have isolated awareness in specific portions of the body, independent of the brain. The most disturbing entry spoke of transferring these isolated fragments between subjects and of his ultimate goal to achieve what he called distributed consciousness across multiple vessels. When asked why he had not shared these details with authorities at the time, Hawkins replied, "I did. Sheriff Muldrow heard my full account. But the next day, he informed me that certain aspects of my testimony would be omitted from the official report to prevent unwarranted hysteria. I was advised quite firmly to forget what I had seen and read." When I protested, the sheriff reminded me that spreading tales of such nature could be considered a form of public disturbance under county ordinance. Holcomb's paper caused a brief stir in academic circles, but gained little public attention. The Washington County Historical Society officially distanced itself from her conclusions, and in 1951, many of the original documents relating to the Boyle case were removed from public access, ostensibly for preservation purposes. Holcomb herself accepted a position at an East Coast university the following year and published nothing further on the subject. In a curious postscript to Holcomb's involvement, her personal papers, donated to her university's archives after her death in 1978, included a sealed envelope with instructions that it remain unopened until 2025. This stipulation has been respected, and the contents remain unknown as of this recording. The case receded from memory until 1967, when construction of a new highway through the region necessitated geological surveys near the former Boyle property. Engineers discovered that the cave system was more extensive than previously thought, and that it had been at least partially adapted for human use well before Boyle's arrival in the area. Carbon dating of artifacts found in the deeper chambers suggested activity dating back to the early 1800s, raising the possibility that Boyle had chosen the location specifically for its existing underground features rather than by chance. The survey team, led by geologist Dr. Howard Ramsey, documented a complex network of chambers extending nearly a quarter-mile into the hillside. What they found suggested that Boyle had substantially modified the natural cave system for his own purposes. Chisel marks on the walls indicated deliberate expansion of certain chambers, while others had been carefully sealed. Most intriguing was evidence of a sophisticated ventilation system, narrow shafts that had been bored through the limestone to the surface, allowing air circulation throughout the complex. In the deepest chamber, accessible only through a narrow passage that required crawling, the team discovered what appeared to be a workshop area far more extensive than what had been revealed in the 1923 investigation. Stone tables had been carved from the living rock, with channels cut into their surfaces leading to collection basins. Ramsey's official report described the markings as reminiscent of anatomical illustrations combined with electrical circuit diagrams, suggesting a disturbing attempt to merge biological and mechanical concepts within a framework that defies conventional scientific categorization. Photographs taken of the markings were later examined by linguists and cryptographers, who concluded that they represented a coherent notational system rather than random scrawlings, though its precise meaning could not be deciphered. Rusted fragments of metal implements were embedded in the cave floor, and the walls were covered in elaborate markings, diagrams, notations, and what appeared to be a complex symbolic language unlike anything the team had encountered before. Among the most disturbing discoveries was a small leather-bound volume found wedged in a crevice, apparently overlooked during the 1923 investigation. The journal, believed to be in Ellen Morrison's handwriting, contained only a few legible entries due to water damage. The most intact passage, dated January 1868, read, "T believes he has identified the precise moment when awareness separates from physical form. He speaks of capturing this instant, extending it indefinitely. I can no longer reconcile these pursuits with the man of healing I once knew." And yet the subject shows no outward signs of distress, maintains responses to stimuli. Perhaps there is truth in what T suggests, that what we perceive as a singular consciousness is in fact divisible. Another partially legible entry described modifications to the cave system. T has discovered that the limestone possesses unusual properties. He claims it responds to the resonance of consciousness, whatever that might mean. The chambers he has selected for different phases of the work are based on some principle of acoustic reflection that he refuses to fully explain. I have observed that sounds behave strangely in certain areas. Voices seem to echo in impossible ways, as though coming from multiple directions simultaneously. The subject mentioned was presumably the mysterious third resident of the cabin. The journal offered no further clarification as to this person's identity, though it suggested they were not a willing participant in whatever studies Boyle was conducting. The final legible entry, heavily damaged and dated only February 1869, contained a disturbing fragment. Cannot continue as witness to this. The chamber below grows with his obsession. Last night he spoke of the ultimate separation, dividing his own consciousness as final proof of his theory. I fear what he intends for us all when The remainder of the page was lost to water damage, and no further entries were found. The journal was transferred to the University of Arkansas archives, where it remained until being controversially removed during a collection reorganization in 1968. Its current whereabouts are unknown. Dr. Ramsey's team also recovered physical artifacts that defied easy explanation. Among these was a partial device constructed of brass, wood, and what metallurgical analysis later identified as an unusual alloy containing elements not typically used in 19th century metallurgy. The device, approximately the size of a human head, consisted of a series of concentric rings designed to rotate independently with small crystalline structures mounted at precise intervals. Engineers who examined the device suggested it might have been designed to generate specific electromagnetic patterns, though its exact purpose remained speculative. More disturbing were the human remains found embedded in the walls of the deepest chamber. Unlike the scattered fragments discovered in 1923, these appeared to have been deliberately placed within the limestone itself. Dr. Ramsey described in his field notes finding a human hand, remarkably preserved, embedded in the cave wall as though the living rock had grown around it. Attempts to extract the remains for examination were unsuccessful, as they appeared to have become part of the mineral structure of the cave itself. The most disturbing theory about the Boyle case emerged not from historical records, but from a series of interviews conducted by journalist Martin Clyde with elderly residents of Washington County in 1962, published in the regional folklore collection Shadows of the Ozarks. Several interviewees, who would have been children in the years following the Civil War, recalled stories told by their parents about a strange man who occasionally emerged from the woods near the Boyle property to trade for supplies at distant settlements. According to these accounts, the man never spoke but communicated through written notes. He kept his face heavily bandaged, which locals assumed was due to war injuries. One woman, identified as Agnes Thornton, aged 94 at the time of the interview, recalled her father describing the man's appearance. Pa said when the bandages shifted, it wasn't like looking at an injured man at all. It was like looking at something incomplete, as though pieces that should have been there were missing, yet he moved and functioned all the same. Another elderly resident, James Wilson, recounted a story from his grandfather, who had encountered the stranger in 1871. Grandpa was hunting near Bear Creek when he came across a man sitting perfectly still beside a fallen tree. He called out a greeting, but the man didn't respond. When Grandpa approached, the man turned to face him, and that's when he noticed something wasn't right. The stranger's movements were too precise, too mechanical, and though his face was mostly covered, Grandpa swore that what little skin was visible seemed to shift in unnatural ways, as though what lay beneath wasn't quite settled. These folkloric accounts suggested that one of the cabin's residents might have survived whatever occurred in February 1869. More disturbingly, they hinted at the possibility that Boyle's experiments had produced results of some kind, results that manifested in a physically altered survivor who remained in the region for some time after the cabin's abandonment. Clyde's collection included another account that added a particularly unsettling dimension to the legend. Sarah Collins, whose father had been part of the search party organized after Hawkins' discovery of the cabin, claimed that her father had told her of finding strange markings on trees in the forest surrounding the Boyle property. These markings reportedly resembled the anatomical diagrams later discovered in the cave system, but with one crucial difference. They appeared to have been carved from the inside of the trees outward, as though something within the wood itself had created them. Archaeological investigations in 1967 provided some physical corroboration for these accounts. In addition to the cave system, researchers discovered a series of crude shelters in the surrounding forest, suggesting someone had lived nomadically in the area for years after the cabin was abandoned. Carbon dating of fire pits and discarded items indicated occupation until approximately 1880, after which all signs of human presence ceased. The researchers also found several trees with unusual growth patterns and internal scarring consistent with the markings described in local folklore. Botanical examination revealed that the internal structure of these trees had been altered in ways that could not be easily explained by natural phenomena or conventional human intervention. One biologist noted that the cellular patterns within the affected wood resembled a deliberate reorganization of the living tissue, as though the trees had been trained to grow in specific patterns from the inside. The most compelling piece of evidence came from a metal box recovered from one of these shelters. Inside was a handwritten document that has defied definitive authentication. The paper, dated 1878, contains what appears to be a confession or final testament. What remains of my original self diminishes with each passing season, while that which Boyle introduced grows stronger. The document goes on to describe, in fragmented and often incoherent terms, a procedure conducted in the cave beneath the cabin, during which the writer claims to have experienced the separation of awareness from unified being. The account suggests that Boyle had somehow attempted to divide or transfer consciousness itself, with catastrophic results for all involved. The handwriting matches neither Boyle's journals nor Ellen Morrison's recovered writings. It begins, "I who write these words am not as I once was." Ellen fled when she understood what had been done, the document states, taking with her the portion of Boyle that remained human. What was left of him pursued, driven by the fragmented awareness that could not reconcile its division. I alone remain, neither what I was nor wholly what was introduced. The experiment succeeded and failed simultaneously. The text continues with increasingly disjointed observations, including references to the resonance of divided consciousness within the limestone chambers, and awareness spreading through the living wood seeking reconnection. Most disturbing is the writer's claim that the boundaries between self and other have dissolved. I perceive from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The forest hears through my ears, and I see through its leaves. Division has become multiplication. The document concludes with a disturbing statement. I write this knowing it shall be my final communication. The division grows unsustainable. Soon, the remaining fragments will collapse into one another, and what emerges will no longer retain memory of its origins. Perhaps this is Boyle's ultimate success, the creation of an entirely new form of consciousness, born from the deliberate fracturing of three into something other. The authenticity of this document remains hotly debated among the few scholars aware of its existence. Some dismiss it as an elaborate hoax, perhaps perpetrated by local residents to enhance the Boyle legend. Allison Chambers, a neuropsychologist who examined the document in 1969, noted that its structure reflected a mind attempting to process information from multiple perspectives simultaneously, consistent with certain rare neurological conditions in which the integration of consciousness is disrupted. She suggested that if the document was authentic, it might represent the written output of an individual experiencing a profound dissociative state, possibly as a result of severe psychological trauma or an unknown neurological condition. What cannot be disputed is the unusual nature of the human bone fragments recovered from the cave system. Others point to linguistic analysis, suggesting it contains patterns consistent with mid-19th century medical terminology combined with unique neologisms that would be difficult for a hoaxer to fabricate. When analyzed in 1967, several pieces displayed evidence of precise surgical modification, including unusual drill patterns and marks from unknown implements. More disturbing were traces of a metallic alloy found embedded in some fragments, suggesting some form of early attempt at combining biological tissue with mechanical components, a procedure far beyond the known medical capabilities of the 1860s. Metallurgical analysis of the alloy revealed a composition that included conventional metals such as copper and iron, but also traces of elements that would not be identified by science until the early 20th century. Dr. Kenneth Foster, the metallurgist who conducted the analysis, noted in his report that the precision of the integration between the metallic components and the bone structure suggests a technological sophistication inconsistent with 19th century medical capabilities. The alloy appears to have been designed specifically to interface with living tissue in a manner that modern medicine is only beginning to explore. The Geological Survey team also documented unusual properties in the limestone formations of the cave system. The stone exhibited abnormal crystalline structures and electromagnetic properties not typically associated with limestone deposits. Dr. Ramsey observed that certain chambers produced acoustic effects that defied conventional explanation. Sounds made in one area would be reproduced in distant parts of the cave with greater clarity than in the immediate vicinity, while other areas seemed to absorb sound completely, creating pockets of unnatural silence. Most puzzling was the discovery of what appeared to be organic material integrated into the mineral structure of the cave walls. Biological analysis indicated that this material contained human cellular components that had somehow been preserved within the stone itself. Dr. Elizabeth Warner, a biologist on the survey team, described finding tissue samples that appear to exist in a state between living and mineral, as though the boundary between organic and inorganic matter has been deliberately blurred. The Boyle case was effectively sealed in 1968 when a university committee determined that the remaining evidence was too fragmented to support scientific conclusions. The cave entrance was permanently closed during highway construction, and the collection of documents and artifacts was dispersed among various institutions, effectively preventing any comprehensive re-examination. Yet the story persists in regional folklore. Locals still speak of strange sounds emanating from the forested hills near the former Boyle property on particularly still nights, sounds described as neither fully human nor entirely mechanical. Hikers occasionally report discovering crude stone shelters deep in the woods, always empty, but giving the impression of recent abandonment. Perhaps most unsettling are the reports from construction workers who participated in sealing the cave entrance in 1968. Several claim to have heard what sounded like methodical tapping coming from deep within the sealed passages, a rhythmic pattern that one worker, a former military radio operator, recognized as Morse code, repeatedly spelling out a single phrase, "Division incomplete." In the decades following the sealing of the cave, the area around the former Boyle property has developed a reputation for unusual phenomena. Electronic devices frequently malfunction in the vicinity. Compasses exhibit unpredictable variations. Visitors report experiencing a peculiar dissociation, described by one hiker as a sensation of observing oneself from multiple perspectives simultaneously, as though consciousness has been temporarily fragmented and redistributed. The forest itself displays biological anomalies that have attracted scientific attention. Botanical studies conducted in the 1980s documented unusual growth patterns in the vegetation surrounding the former cabin site. Trees exhibit symmetrical deformities that appear to mirror each other across considerable distances, while certain plants demonstrate what botanists term non-local response patterns, physical changes in one specimen triggering identical changes in distant plants with no apparent connection. In 1969, exactly 1 century after the discovery of the abandoned Boyle cabin, anthropologist Dr. James Wilford proposed what may be the most rational explanation for the case. After reviewing the available evidence, Wilford suggested that Tobias Boyle had likely been suffering from severe post-traumatic stress related to his wartime experiences, possibly complicated by mercury poisoning, common among Civil War surgeons who used the element in various treatments. Wilford theorized that Boyle's deteriorating mental state led to delusions about the nature of consciousness, inspired by the battlefield phenomenon of soldiers remaining momentarily animate even after receiving fatal wounds. His experiments were likely the manifestations of advanced psychosis, with Ellen Morrison and the unidentified third resident becoming either victims of or participants in his delusions. Yet, Wilford's rational explanation fails to account for several elements: the sophisticated modifications to the cave system, the technically advanced surgical marks on the recovered bone fragments, and the metallic alloy that metallurgists confirmed was inconsistent with any known formulation from that period. Moreover, county records indicate that 3 separate search parties in the 1870s, looking for missing hunters, reported encountering a figure moving with unnatural coordination in the deep woods near the Boyle property, only to find themselves unable to maintain pursuit as an overwhelming sense of disorientation affected all members simultaneously. Adding to the mystery is the fate of several researchers who have attempted to investigate the Boyle case over the years. Dr. Margaret Holcomb's abrupt career change in 1952 coincided with a 3-month hospitalization for what official records described as acute nervous exhaustion. Her personal correspondence from this period, discovered among her papers after her death, includes disturbing references to intrusive thoughts that do not feel like my own, and the sensation of observing myself from outside as though my consciousness has become partially detached. Similarly, Dr. Howard Ramsey, who led the Geological Survey in 1967, resigned from his position shortly after submitting his official report. He subsequently relocated to a remote area of Oregon, where he lived in relative isolation until his death in 1979. His personal journals, obtained by his nephew in 1998, reveal an increasing preoccupation with the integration of consciousness across biological and mineral substrates, and contain elaborate diagrams reminiscent of those found in the Boyle cave system, though Ramsay had reportedly never seen the original markings. In 1975, historian Thomas Blackwood attempted to compile a comprehensive account of the Boyle case for his doctoral dissertation. After 6 months of research, during which he reported encountering systematic obstruction from various institutions holding relevant materials, Blackwood abandoned the project. In a letter to his academic advisor, he wrote, "I cannot escape the sensation that the more I investigate this matter, the more it investigates me in return. I find myself thinking thoughts that seem to originate elsewhere, as though the very act of focusing on the Boyle case has opened channels of influence I cannot control." Blackwood's subsequent academic work avoided any mention of Boyle or the Ozark discoveries. When contacted by a journalist in 1992 regarding his abandoned research, Blackwood replied with a brief note stating only, "Some doors, once opened, cannot be fully closed again. The Boyle matter is best left undisturbed." He declined all further communication on the subject until his death in 2005. The pattern of researchers abandoning their investigations after prolonged exposure to the case materials has contributed to the fragmentary nature of available information. This pattern itself has become the subject of academic interest, with psychologist Dr. Rebecca Lane suggesting in a 1998 paper that the Boyle case may represent a mimetic contagion, a set of ideas that, once engaged with deeply enough, begin to alter the cognitive patterns of the researcher in predictable ways. Lane theorized that Boyle's writings about divided consciousness might function as a form of cognitive virus, restructuring the thought patterns of those who immerse themselves in studying them. The recurring reports of dissociative experiences among Boyle researchers, she wrote, suggest the possibility that prolonged engagement with these concepts may induce neurological changes that mirror the very phenomena Boyle was attempting to create. Lane's theory received little mainstream attention, and she herself stopped publishing on the subject after 2001. Her current whereabouts and academic status are unknown. In 1983, the Journal of Parapsychological Research published an article by Dr. Marcus Winters proposing that the Boyle case represented a sustained incident of consciousness-environment interaction. Winters suggested that Boyle's experiments, whatever their nature, might have created a localized field effect that continued to influence the surrounding area long after the original events had concluded. The integration of human cellular material with the mineral structure of the cave, Winters wrote, suggests a deliberate attempt to extend consciousness beyond its conventional biological boundaries. If even partially successful, such an experiment might create a persistent effect, a form of awareness embedded in the landscape itself, capable of influencing the perceptions of those who enter its sphere of influence. Winters's theories were largely dismissed by mainstream science, but they gained traction among those who had experienced unexplained phenomena in the vicinity of the former Boyle property. Local guides who occasionally led hikers through the region collected accounts of visitors experiencing sudden shifts in perception, including the sensation of thoughts not one's own and memories that seemed to belong to someone else. One such account, documented by folklorist Patricia Reynolds in 1989, came from a geology student who had camped near the sealed cave entrance while on a field trip. The student reported waking in the middle of the night with a perfect understanding of how consciousness could be divided and distributed across multiple substrates. He claimed to have filled several pages of his notebook with complex diagrams and equations explaining the process, despite having no background in neuroscience or advanced physics. When examined the next morning, the student's notes appeared to be written in a handwriting markedly different from his own. The content, analyzed by specialists in various fields, contained concepts that one physicist described as theoretically sophisticated beyond current scientific understanding, yet internally consistent. The student himself had no memory of writing the notes and dropped out of his geology program shortly thereafter. Whatever the truth behind the Boyle cabin and its occupants, the case represents one of the most disturbing chapters in Ozark history, a story of isolation, obsession, and the potentially catastrophic consequences of pursuing knowledge beyond conventional boundaries. The mountain hollow where the cabin once stood remains strangely devoid of wildlife to this day, according to forestry surveys. The few hikers who inadvertently camp in the area often report unusually vivid dreams in which they perceive themselves from multiple perspectives simultaneously. The highway constructed in 1968, which passes within a half-mile of the former Boyle property, has recorded an unusually high rate of single-vehicle accidents along the stretch nearest the site. Traffic safety studies note that these accidents often involve drivers with no history of recklessness suddenly veering off the road for no apparent reason. Survivors frequently report experiencing a momentary dissociation or the sensation of someone else's thoughts intruding into their awareness just before losing control. Local folklore has integrated the Boyle story into broader narratives about the Ozarks, with some older residents claiming that the region has never been quite right since the events of 1869. They speak of certain areas in the forest where sounds echo in impossible ways, where shadows move independently of their casters, and where visitors occasionally find themselves experiencing memories they cannot explain. Vivid recollections of medical procedures or underground chambers they have never seen. The final documented connection to the Boyle case came in 1962, when an elderly patient at the Arkansas State Hospital in Little Rock, admitted with advanced dementia, began producing detailed technical drawings during periods of apparent lucidity. The drawings depicted a complex mechanism for what the patient labeled consciousness division and storage. Medical staff initially dismissed these as meaningless, until a visiting doctor recognized similarities to the diagrams reportedly found in the Boyle cave system. When questioned about the drawings, the patient, who had been admitted under the name John Smith and whose true identity remained unknown, reportedly replied, "The separation was successful, but incomplete. Fragments remain. I am not one and not three." When the final division collapses, the truth of Boyle's work will be understood. The patient died 3 days later. An autopsy revealed unusual structures within the brain tissue that the examining pathologist described as unlike anything in medical literature, areas where neural matter appears to have been systematically reorganized according to some unknown principle. The attending physician, Dr. Robert Chambers, documented finding small metallic objects embedded in the patient's brain tissue, objects that bore a striking resemblance to components of the device recovered from the Boyle cave system in 1967. More disturbing still was the discovery that these objects had been surgically implanted decades earlier, possibly as far back as the 1860s, yet showed no signs of rejection or deterioration. Dr. Chambers' report concluded with a disturbing observation. The patient's brain structure suggests a deliberate surgical reorganization inconsistent with any known medical procedure. More concerning is evidence that this reorganization was conducted while the patient was conscious and continued to function cognitively, implying a level of neurological understanding that exceeds current medical science. Whatever was done to this individual represents either a disturbing case of protracted torture or a medical breakthrough of profound implications. The patient's records and drawings were sealed by hospital administrators and have never been released to researchers. The body was cremated before independent examination could be arranged. Whether this individual had any direct connection to the events at the Boyle cabin remains speculative, but the timing and nature of the drawings have led some to suggest that the final survivor of whatever occurred in that remote hollow might have lived well into the 20th century, carrying within them the evidence of Tobias Boyle's disturbing legacy. In 1994, during renovations at the Arkansas State Archives, a maintenance worker discovered a sealed metal container hidden within a wall cavity. The container held a collection of glass photographic plates dating from approximately 1869, apparently documenting aspects of the original Boyle investigation that had been omitted from official records. The images, badly degraded by time, included photographs of the cabin interior, close-ups of the journals, and several shots of the specimens found in the glass jars. State historians who examined the plates noted that they appeared to be the work of Theodore Hardings, an early photographer known to have worked with the Washington County Sheriff's Office during that period. The discovery prompted brief renewed interest in the case, but attempts to enhance and preserve the images were hampered by their deteriorated condition. Before comprehensive analysis could be completed, the plates were transferred to a climate-controlled storage facility, where they reportedly vanished during a subsequent inventory assessment. The disappearance of the photographic evidence added to the pattern of systematic removal of primary sources related to the Boyle case, fueling speculation about deliberate suppression. Professor Edgar Williams, a historian specializing in government secrecy, has suggested that the Boyle materials may have been intentionally scattered or destroyed due to their disturbing implications. The pattern we observe with the Boyle evidence, Williams wrote in a 2001 article, is consistent with how organizations handle information deemed too dangerous for public consumption, not through a single act of destruction, but through gradual dispersal, reclassification, and loss of materials until comprehensive study becomes impossible. Williams noted that similar patterns could be observed in the handling of documentation related to certain military research programs, particularly those involving human experimentation. He suggested that Boyle's military background and the timing of his disappearance, coinciding with the post-war period when the government was absorbing Confederate medical research, might indicate that his private experiments had connections to more official programs. This theory gained unexpected support in 2012, when declassified military archives revealed that a special medical research unit had indeed operated during the final years of the Civil War, tasked with investigating methods to enhance soldier resilience and recovery. The unit, designated only as Department S, reported directly to the Confederate Surgeon General and operated with minimal oversight. Records indicate that a surgeon with the surname Boyle was briefly attached to this unit in late 1864, though specific details of his research were not included in the surviving documentation. More intriguing was the discovery that Department S continued to operate in modified form after the war's conclusion, with several key researchers being quietly integrated into federal medical programs despite their Confederate backgrounds. A memo dated August 1865 references the unique insights of Dr. B and the importance of continuing his work under appropriate supervision. Whether this referred to Tobias Boyle remains speculative, but the timing aligns with his disappearance from conventional records. The possibility that Boyle's work might have had institutional backing, or at least interest, adds another layer to the mystery. It raises questions about whether his retreat to the Ozarks represented a genuine flight from authority or a deliberate relocation to continue controversial research away from public scrutiny. The presence of the elaborate cave system beneath the cabin site suggests a level of infrastructure inconsistent with the resources of a single rogue surgeon. Today, the Ozark Mountains have largely reclaimed the site where the cabin once stood. The hollow appears unremarkable to casual observers, though electronic equipment frequently malfunctions in the vicinity. Local guides refuse to lead hikers to the exact location, citing a persistent local belief that some places hold echoes of things best left undisturbed. The few researchers who have attempted to reopen the case have found most of the original evidence inaccessible, redacted, or missing entirely. The highway that passes near the site continues to report an unusual number of accidents, many involving drivers who later describe experiencing a momentary sense of dissociation or intrusive thoughts just before losing control of their vehicles. Traffic safety engineers have installed additional guardrails and warning signs along this stretch, attributing the accident cluster to conventional factors such as road curvature and wind patterns. However, internal reports acknowledge the statistical anomaly of the accident distribution, which does not correlate with standard risk factors. Forest rangers responsible for the area have documented unusual patterns in local wildlife behavior. Animals appear to avoid a roughly circular area centered on the former cabin site, creating what one ranger described as a dead zone that moves according to no pattern we can discern. Motion-activated wildlife cameras occasionally capture images of deer or other animals freezing in place at the perimeter of this zone, staring fixedly at something not visible in the frame before rapidly retreating. Botanical surveys reveal that plants within this zone exhibit accelerated growth patterns but reduced reproductive success. Trees grow faster but produce fewer viable seeds, while flowering plants bloom with unusual intensity but fail to attract normal pollinator activity. Soil samples show elevated concentrations of certain minerals typically associated with deeper geological strata, suggesting some form of ongoing exchange between the surface environment and the cave system below. In 2007, geologist Dr. Sandra Martinez conducted a non-invasive ground-penetrating radar survey of the area as part of a broader study of Ozark karst formations. Her results indicated that the cave system sealed in 1968 has continued to expand, with new chambers forming along fracture lines that radiate outward from the original complex. Martinez noted that such expansion would normally occur over geological time frames rather than mere decades, suggesting an accelerated process driven by unknown factors. More disturbing was Martinez's discovery that the cave system appears to have developed features inconsistent with natural limestone formations. The radar imaging revealed chamber structures with geometric precision, perfect spheres, and interconnected cylindrical passages that, in Martinez's assessment, suggest deliberate design rather than natural processes. Her attempts to secure funding for more detailed investigation were unsuccessful, with review committees citing methodological concerns despite her established reputation in the field. Martinez's research assistant, graduate student David Chen, continued unofficial investigations during personal hiking trips to the area. In 2009, Chen reported discovering a narrow fissure that appeared to connect to the sealed cave system. Using remote sensing equipment of his own design, he claimed to have detected organized electrical activity within the caves, regular patterns of weak electromagnetic pulses that, in his words, resemble nothing so much as the firing patterns of neural networks. Chen's academic advisors discouraged further pursuit of these findings, citing concerns about his professional reputation. He subsequently left the geology program and reportedly relocated to a remote area of Canada. His final communication to colleagues, an email sent in 2010, stated only, "I understand now what Boyle was attempting. The division of consciousness is not an end, but a beginning. What emerges from properly structured fragmentation is not less than the original awareness, but exponentially more. I go to observe the process firsthand." No further contact from Chen has been reported. A missing persons investigation was briefly opened but closed when Canadian authorities reported that Chen had legally established residence in a northern territory and appeared to be living as a voluntary recluse. Attempts by former colleagues to locate him have been unsuccessful. Perhaps the most fitting conclusion to the story of the Boyle cabin comes from the words of Dr. Margaret Holcomb, written shortly before her academic career abruptly changed direction in 1952. The true horror of the Boyle case lies not in the possibility that his experiment succeeded, but in the implication that success and failure in such a context might be indistinguishable. If consciousness can indeed be divided, extracted, or transferred, then what remains of our understanding of human identity? Perhaps the most merciful outcome is that the evidence remains fragmented and incomplete, much like, one suspects, whatever emerged from that cabin in the winter of 1869. The hollow remains silent now, save for the whisper of wind through the trees. But those familiar with the story of Tobias Boyle and his cabin sometimes claim that if you stand in just the right spot, where the foundation stones lie buried beneath decades of forest growth, you might perceive a subtle doubling of your own thoughts, a momentary sense of observing yourself from both within and without. And in that instant, they say, you might understand what drew a damaged Civil War surgeon to this remote place, and what terrible knowledge he sought to verify in the isolation of the Ozark Mountains. Dr. James Henderson, a neurologist who has studied cases of dissociative identity disorder, offered a final perspective on the Boyle case in a 2018 interview. What fascinates me about this historical account is not whether Boyle actually succeeded in dividing or transferring consciousness, but rather what the persistence of the story tells us about our own deep anxieties regarding the nature of selfhood. We cling to the notion that consciousness is unified and indivisible, because the alternative, that what we experience as a singular I might be merely a convenient illusion, is fundamentally threatening to our conception of humanity. Henderson continued, whether Boyle was a madman, a visionary, or simply a traumatized surgeon whose delusions have been magnified by decades of folkloric embellishment, his story touches on primal fears about the fragility of identity. Perhaps that's why the case continues to disturb us, not because of what might have happened in that cabin, but because of what it suggests about the precarious nature of what we call the self. As this account concludes, the mysteries of the Boyle cabin remain largely unsolved. The scattered evidence continues to resist coherent assembly, with key documents missing, witnesses long dead, and the physical site itself altered by decades of natural reclamation and deliberate obfuscation. What remains is a haunting possibility, that in the aftermath of a war that shattered the nation's unity, a disturbed surgeon sought to prove that human consciousness itself could be similarly fragmented, with consequences that continue to echo through the hollow silence of the Ozark Mountains. The forest has reclaimed the site now. Hikers occasionally stumble upon stone foundations half buried in moss, not realizing they stand upon the remnants of the Boyle cabin. Those who linger too long report strange sensations, a heaviness in the air, a doubling of perception, or what one visitor described as the unsettling feeling that something is watching me watching myself. They move on quickly, carrying away nothing but vague unease, and perhaps, if Boyle's theories held any truth, fragments of awareness not entirely their own. For those who know where to look, the signs remain: trees growing in unnatural symmetry, stones arranged in patterns that mirror the diagrams in Boyle's journals, and on particularly still nights, the distant sound of methodical tapping emanating from deep within the sealed earth. Division incomplete indeed.